Well, guys, welcome back to part 2 of building this sauna in the woods, mostly out of pallets, for something like 50 bucks. We're going to jump right into it here because you guys have been waiting like way too long for this video to come out. So if you guys followed the pallet cabin build, you know that we did the exterior using pallet shingles, overlaying them, typical shingle technique. And while that did work really well, it used a lot of pallets, and I kind of wanted to expedite this build a little bit, even though it ended up taking me months longer than I expected. So I had this idea in my mind, and I wanted to give it a try. I'm calling it Dirtbag board and batten, and you basically frame the structure in with pallets, and then you just fill in the gaps between the boards with more pallet boards. This style worked really well, and I was able to reuse the pallet nails, which was awesome. It only took about one pallet per framing pallet to fill it in, if that makes sense. The biggest struggles of this style was that a lot of these pallets are hardwood, and let me tell you what, nailing into hardwood fucking sucks, especially when you're trying to reuse a bunch of half-bent, rusty pallet nails that have been sitting in a bucket for months. Tell you what though, I've gotten really good at hammering in nails that are cockeyed, so that's a bonus, I guess. Word to the wise, this board and batten style that I did is probably not super waterproof, but, it's going to be a wet room in the woods, so I decided it was fine. I got a little creative on the front side here and did this funky shingle technique, which worked great till I tried to cut them off with a Sawzall and left a bunch of gaps, so we had to fix those. But overall, I would recommend this board and batten technique. I enjoyed doing it. It went pretty quickly. And if you had a good overhang on your structure, I think it would work pretty well. Look at that sun coming through the trees. That is just my favorite part about working in the woods. I look so majestic. I've just got a few more boards to nail on here, so I'm going to take a breather, sip of coffee, and let you guys enjoy this finishing shot. That's nice. Okay, we're back. So, this was one of the most stressful aspects of this build for me. I thought about this day and night, wondering what I was going to do. Is the stove going to burn down? Is this going to work? Am I going to be a failure at everything in life? But in classic Jake style, I took all of those thoughts and feelings, melted them down in the crucible of self, and they popped out as, fuck it, let's just do it anyway. So I started with some chicken wire I had lying around and nailed it across the pass-through where the stove is going to enter the sauna. I left the exterior accessible so that I could drop some rocks in there and get them up to the level where I wanted the stove to rest. This was not my original plan, and if you follow my shorts, you know there was some drama that led us here. But that is okay, because it gave me the opportunity to do this very involved hearth building process and try a bunch of things that I'd wanted to try for quite a while. You can always trust the universe to put you through trials that you didn't necessarily ask for, but you probably needed. So right now we're building a platform that the 55-gallon drum barrel stove that I built will be resting on. If you want to catch a video of me building that stove, I'll put a card in the right-hand corner of the screen or a link in the description. It's on my channel. You can find it. Now, a lot of keyboard warriors were coming out of the woodwork telling me that this hearth style was just foolish or not making sense to them. And I'll admit, I was very much winging it. That was kind of the spirit of this entire build. Let's just try a bunch of things that I've never done before and see how they turn out. There's a couple details that might help clarify why I decided to build it this way. First of all, the major consideration in everything that I'm building is cost and how easily I can gather materials. So for instance, I could have built the hearth out of concrete, but I didn't want to have that impact on the environment, number one, and number two, that would have cost, some money anyway. But what resource is free and readily available pretty much anywhere in the world? Dirt, clay, mud. That's why many homes and buildings used this material before the Industrial Revolution, and, it's still around. It hasn't gone anywhere. The same principle applied to why I used all these rocks. Honestly, they were just on the property and were easy for me to gather. I was trying to find some bricks or a different solution, but I just couldn't find any. And so, I used what I had around. So here I started with kind of a mud-clay mixture and was basically just trying to use it like mortar to set these rocks in place and build up a sturdy base that the stove could sit on. This was actually my plan of how I was going to do the entire hearth. But you'll see in the video, I ended up having to pivot, and I'll tell you why. But for now, I was pleasantly surprised and impressed at how well this was working. At first, I was trying to spread the mud with my hands, and that just wasn't working. But then I used this little wood cut-off piece as a trowel, and that started working really well. You can see I'm using the lid from a 55-gallon drum as kind of a guide to know how to build the base for this so that the stove will rest securely. And once I felt good about the base I had built, I went about just cutting through both layers of this chicken wire so that I could create a hole that the stove would be able to pass through. Now, why is the stove half inside and half outside the sauna? Many people have asked that question. Honestly, purely convenience. I thought it would be easier if I could load wood from the outside of the sauna rather than getting in and getting it all muddy. I also really like the idea of it being super easy to clean, like I just go outside, lift the hatch up, and scrape out all the wood ashes. I knew I would lose some heat by not having the stovepipe inside the sauna, but this way was just easier. I didn't have to design a fireproof pass-through in the ceiling, and the barrel was just too big to fit in there anyway. Not gonna lie, getting this stove in place was the product of a couple trial and error attempts. I thought it would go a lot faster than it did, but I've learned I always think that anytime I build something, so I really just kind of plan for it now. This is my clay hole that I was sourcing my clay from. It actually started as a little animal tunnel, and I could see inside that it was a very fine-grained particulate, and figured it was probably pretty clay dense. There's a test you can do where you pick some up in your hand and you squish it into a ball, and if it holds its shape and it doesn't fall apart, then you know it's got a lot of clay in the soil there. I used that test on this spot and found that it held its shape just fine, so we were good to go. This is about the time when I discovered the hearth building technique I was using was no longer going to work. I had been using this hole to mix the muddy clay mortar stuff, but when I came back a day or two after digging it, it had filled up with groundwater. I tried to clear it out a bit and mix the same consistency that I had had on the first day, but it just kept coming out so wet, and that ended up being a problem, and I'll show you why. So at this point, I had the other side locked in pretty well, and it was supporting the majority of the stove, and I just had to do kind of the same thing on this side. Build a sturdy base that would hold the weight of the stove. But you could see in that last shot, the mud was just dripping right off my paddle, and it was not really holding its form anymore, just kind of running everywhere and making a huge mess. I started to get really frustrated and realized that there was no way I was going to be able to build these rocks all the way up around this stove with this runny, muddy mixture. Enter Woodchip Cob. Admittedly, I've never seen anyone do this before, but I just figured, like, it's probably gonna work. I took a bunch of that runny, wet, muddy stuff, and I just ended up mixing it with a bunch of buckets of wood chips until it dried out a bit and gained that more tacky consistency that I was looking for. This process is backbreaking, and if I was going to do it on a larger scale, I would come up with a different method than using my back and a shovel to get it mixed. But right away, I was so happy that I did this because it worked great. It was so spreadable and held its form perfectly. Here you can finally see what I was actually doing with this chicken wire. It was just supposed to be like a lattice to hold these rocks in place because I knew that they would fall over if I tried to stack them up that high. And now that I had this Woodchip Cob thing going, the hearth build really took off and became a fun, easy process. I pretty much alternated between stacking rocks up inside the chicken wire and then filling the outside in with Woodchip Cob. The real theory here was that the rocks would provide a thermal barrier between the stove and the wood so that no wood would be touching any super hot source and potentially combust. If I could go back and do it again, I would leave a little bit more room at the top because that's only about 5 inches between the wood and the stove, and I think ideally it should be a little bit more. But at this point it was too far to go back, so I just sealed up the chicken wire, put some more cob on, and trusted that I didn't just create a giant firebomb in the middle of the woods. You can see here how the Woodchip Cob will even spread vertically. Like, it really holds its shape, and I was blown away. It also provides a little thermal mass for the stove to trap some of the heat in and keep it from just escaping through the thin steel walls of the barrel. And here it is all done. It was a messy job, but I really like how it turned out. It looks very Miyazaki. If you've been following my shorts content, you know that getting this stove working was kind of like a whole thing. But I decided to skip that in this video and maintain the cinematic illusion that let you know it all just worked perfectly right out the gate. But there is a sauna shorts playlist on my channel if you want the drama. Finally, though, the stove is burning, it's working, everything's done. We get to move on to the interior. So here we are, finally getting to the part that inspired this entire build, which is using these old fence boards that I was able to source as an interior for the sauna. This has been an idea of mine for probably a decade, and I finally was able to stumble across some tongue and groove cedar fence boards that were totally free. All I had to do was hound my friend for a couple months and beg him to give them to me after he tore down his old fence. Just kidding. I didn't beg. Grovel is probably more the term. Now, this was a pretty lucky find, but you could do this without tongue and groove fence boards. It might not seal the air in quite as well, but it would work, and if you were really handy, you could just tongue and groove them yourself with a router or a table saw. Oh, did I just casually start putting pine needles in the walls without saying anything as if it's a normal thing to do? Yes, I did. Okay, hear me out. There is thinking and reasoning and logic behind this decision. First and foremost, there was a giant pile right next to my house. So, free, available, easy, what can I say? Secondly, wood chip insulation, pine needles, all of them have an R value of around 1 to 1.4 per inch. And if you don't know what R value is, it basically just measures the effectiveness of insulation. The pink fiberglass stuff that you see in a lot of houses has an R value of about 3.5 per inch. So this stuff actually should provide some insulation value. And because it is coniferous, needles, pine, cedar, stuff like that, it should be pretty mold and rot resistant. And this theory is confirmed by me personally because the pile didn't have any mold or fungal activity in it despite sitting for quite a few days. I used it as loose fill in the bottom to cover up all the cracks and crannies, and then I had this wool insulation from a different teardown that I'm working on that I was able to repurpose in this sauna. Wool has an R value similar to fiberglass, and because it has lanolin, this natural oil in it, it's resistant to fungal and rot, so it makes a great insulation. It's also easy to handle with your bare hands and has pretty much no negative health side effects. The pine needles and wool were both pretty wet when I put them in the wall, but I'm fairly confident that they will dry out after using the sauna. After all, wood heat is a drying heat, so yeah, I'm just hoping it'll cook it all out and won't cause too many problems. The biggest downside here was the bucket after bucket of pine needles that I had to carry from, I don't know, a football field or two away from my house. But I think each wall only took about 8 or so buckets to get filled in, so once I decided to do it and gritted my teeth and made it happen, it did go pretty fast. And that was pretty much the system. Put the boards up, backfill with wood chips, and wool on top to make it easy. At this point, it really started to come together, and I realized this place is going to be fucking sick. I could have stopped here, probably, and lit it up and see if it worked, but I wanted it to look good. So we had to move on to trim. Look at that guy. That's a motivated guy. He's getting this done. I'd been dreaming of finishing this fucking skylight since the beginning of the build. I wasn't even planning to put a skylight in here originally, and I've never been in a sauna with a skylight, but I thought it would be really fucking cool. And as I started to get the trim going around this thing, the vision came together, and I really liked it. You can see the beauty of using this tongue and groove is that it locks together and seals up a lot of those holes so that air can't move out of the structure as easily as it would otherwise. For this trim portion, I was able to use a ton of cutoffs that I just had from building the rest of the walls, which always feels so good when it happens. I also almost had a little bit of a breakdown because, again, using these pallet nails for all of this fine detail work was kind of leading me into a point of mental hysteria. But I figured at this point, I can't give up. I've done this whole thing with reused rusty pallet nails. I can push through and do this trim with them too. It's just going to take a little bit more time. If you were following my shorts content, you know that there was a little drama with this skylight as well. But after we got these last couple trim boards up, it came together so well. Here's a shot so you can kind of get a feel for what it's like. I love how the ferns from the green roof kind of poke their head up. For the roof insulation, I had these blankets lying around that were literally just sitting outside, so I decided to use them because I knew they would be easy and I could shove them right in these holes that I had left. A lot of people are worried about them growing mold and having issues, but I've found that these blankets that are made of polyester don't seem to be as prone to molding as like a cotton blanket would be. This one randomly had a picture of St. Mary on it, so hopefully she'll bless the sauna and keep it mold free. I used some of the extra wool to fill in the gaps, and that was pretty much all I did for the roof. Before nailing up the roof boards, I went around and filled in all the little cracks and crannies with a little bit more wool. The goal here was just to seal up any other air holes that were still left over, which could cause heat to escape. If you didn't have any wool on hand, you could always just use like extra clothes, blankets, towels for this sort of thing too. Once the roof boards were up, I could move on to trimming the interior and giving things that finished appeal. For the trim boards, I ended up just using some more of the fence boards, but I ripped them into smaller pieces so that I could make them go a little bit further. This also serves as sort of like a seal for the interior to cover everything up and just make sure the air doesn't have opportunities to get out. While this does take a little bit of time and you want to go slow and get everything as tight as you can, it's one of my favorite parts of building. It really brings everything together and makes the structure feel tidy and complete. Every time you bop a board into place like that and it fits perfectly, you get a nice shot of dopamine and it keeps you going. I know the bin is a bit of an unorthodox cutting station, but that's kind of what this channel is all about, so I'm here for it. If you guys are new to woodworking, just know that your structure is probably going to look like garbage until you get to this finished carpentry stage. So don't stress too much about the details while you're throwing things together in the beginning. Just know that things might look a little gangly, but you'll be able to cover them up at the end. Once I had the upper area of the sauna and the roof pretty much trimmed out, I got to move on to the final stage, which was laying the floorboards. I chose not to insulate the floor simply because I knew it would be a pain in the ass and I didn't want to deal with it. I also figure that it's not going to impact the thermal properties of the sauna that much because heat travels up and I'm going to be elevated on a bench while I'm using it anyway, so it'll probably be fine. To my absolute joy and surprise, I didn't even have to rip the last board down. It just fit perfectly in place. Whenever that happens, it feels like a little gift from the universe, like it's patting me on the head and telling me I did a good job. Just kind of tickles my neurons for a second. For the area under the stove, I wanted to protect it with some river rocks just in case the barrel fails at some point and coals fall down into the sauna area. So I left these trim boards a little bit tall so that they could kind of trap the rocks and keep them in place. I'm going to shut up for a second so you guys can enjoy the sounds of trimming this wall out nice and clean. Ugh, I love that shit. Those are the sounds you just don't get when you're not using, like, analog tools. It's like the fuzz from a record player. You guys know what I mean? It just, like, scratches an itch in your brain. So here I brought in some rocks to finish this under area for the stove. These are not the rocks that I'm going to be dumping water on to create that steamy sauna effect. I'm going to add those to the top. These are just for fire protection and vibes. Now that the floorboards were down, I could finally go in and lay down the last pieces of trim to seal up the interior. At this point in the project, I'm usually just so ready for it to be done, and I really have to cool my jets and make sure I don't make a bunch of mistakes at the last minute. Here, I wanted to seal up this wire just so I don't snag on it while I'm in a post-sauna delirium. It also just makes the hearth look way more clean and finished. The final step was to get this door put together, which honestly I kind of forgot about and neglected till the very end. Check out that bent nail that I started and then just gave the fuck up on. So I needed to create a surface that the door could press up against and seal once it was closed. So here I'm just going around the door frame, adding some extra pallet boards to create a raised surface that the door will make contact with. I don't really know how they do this in like actual home building, but I've done it myself a couple times and it works pretty well. You just have to take your time because doors can be fussy and they require some finesse. I had this live edge board lying around and I thought it would be great for this purpose because one side could be that nice hard edge for the door and the other side would kind of flow down into the sauna space. If you remember that stove drama I was talking about before, this is me basically trying to fix that. I left a door on this side of the stove where I could theoretically load wood if I was hanging out inside the sauna, but it just kept spewing smoke inside every time I would try to light a fire and I couldn't figure out how to stop it, so I just decided to fucking seal it up with a second lid. I think it's fine though because there's not really much room on the interior for wood anyway, and I think the heat will transfer just fine through the thin metal. I had just a bit of this wool left over, which was so cool because I was able to use it as a door seal. I know this looks a little bit silly, but I thought it would work really well because the wool has some springiness to it and it will compress well under pressure. I've also used old bike tubes for this. You can cut the rubber into strips and staple it up and it creates a good surface for sealing. But I didn't want to sacrifice my bike to the sauna gods, so I thought the wool would work just fine. Honestly, for a building that is not square whatsoever, built out of curved boards and wonky pallets, I'm pretty happy with that fit. The last thing I wanted to do was put some kind of latch on the door so that it would seal up nice and tight. Since I was about 23, I've been carrying around a little bin full of random bits and bobs that I collect, and I always go there when I need something for this purpose. I think I got this latch like 8 years ago for a cupboard or something, and I just never ended up using it. And I have no idea where this hook came from, but it's bent up and rusty, so probably somewhere cool. You can see here that you basically put the hook around the latch and pull it tight. I'm happy with this for now, but I do want something that's easier to release in case like a fire starts and I need to get out quickly. But with that final detail, we're pretty much there. There's a couple things I still want to do. I want to build a deck and I want to add a bench so that I can get up a little higher, but I'm ready to test it out and see if it actually works. Now, I didn't actually include the first firing in this video, and I know you guys might be a little bit annoyed at that, but there is a good reason. And the reason really is just life. You know, I do these build videos on the side. I've been trying to build it up as a career for myself at some point, but I still do have a lot of life to live and bills to pay outside of this job. That's the long answer, but the short answer is my phone died and I just didn't get to it. So for now, here's the sauna in its nearly full form. There's still some things to do, but for a couple months' work and about $40 invested, I'm really happy with how it turned out. I feel really inspired by this build just knowing that I was able to build it on such a small budget, and I ended up with this really funky, kind of beautiful structure that also serves a really cool function. And I hope that this content inspires you guys too, because I'm really just out here building some cool shit that makes me excited and trying to push the limits of what I can do without having to full send consumer capitalism. Speaking of capitalism, if you guys would like to support me in making this content, you can do that through Patreon, buying some merch on my website, or just liking this video, sending it to somebody you know who you think might enjoy it. I really appreciate you guys being here with me on this journey and watching me build this funky stuff. It really gets me up in the morning, gets me moving, and makes me want to keep pushing myself. There's a short available on my page where I fire the sauna up after all of this work was finished, so you can check that out if you want to see the drama that ensued. This week I'm going to add a few more finishing details and then hopefully fire it up and get myself sweating inside. So look forward to a video at the end of the week with how that turns out. Until next time, you guys, enjoy these last few shots of the sauna, and I'll catch you out there on the Dirtbag battlefield.